Well, hey, gang. I'm Nate Bush, and I want to invite you back to the Deeper Dive podcast for our Weeds in My Garden series. Today, the message was on loneliness, and as will be form in this podcast, I have a guest today with me, and my guest is Annie Snyder. Annie, will you introduce yourself to everybody who doesn't know you?
Hey guys, it's round two. Last week we talked about anxiety and we're talking about loneliness today. I am a clinical social worker. I am the owner and operator of Albuquerque Mental Health, which is an outpatient counseling agency here in Albuquerque. So I'm here to sort of
Fantastic.
talk about loneliness with Nate.
So, okay, we're going to dive in the deep end right from the beginning. Okay, Annie. So, I posited today in the message, and this was based on the Surgeon General's report, that in America we are facing an epidemic of loneliness, and the connection between loneliness and mental health seems to be related to deep connection. And as I think about, like, you know, loneliness isn't like you're not going to get a clinical diagnosis of, oh, you're lonely. And that's, you're not going to probably look up in the DSM-5 handbook and say, oh, loneliness, that's your answer. Here's the treatment. But it seems to be that the data is showing that loneliness is a precursor to other mental health challenges that people have, like anxiety and depression. And so my question for you just off the bat is, what relationship do you see between like deep connection with other human beings and or to say it in the negative way, loneliness, the lack of that deep connection
Yeah,
to
yeah.
mental well-being? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head in that when talking about loneliness, unlike anxiety or depression or some other quantifiable mental illness that a lot of people may not have experienced, I can guarantee 100% of the people that are either watching this podcast or in church, we have all had periods in our life where we felt lonely. And so even just hearing that, people automatically go, if it's not currently, to a place in their life that
Mm-hmm.
they were painfully lonely, and it hurts. And so I think even though it may not be an issue that all of us are struggling with presently, we have all had that. And so it's a
Mm-hmm.
really great place if you're not struggling to have empathy and to say, I may not be experiencing this right now, but someone out there who I know is. And this is a great opportunity to say, I can help that person. If I'm not experiencing that, that person is, I can help them. And
Mm-hmm.
so one of the things I think is important is that we're talking about the origins of like what loneliness is. And I think when you say it's a lack of meaningful connection, that's huge. We're not talking about general connections because our society is more connected than we ever have been. You know, with the rise of social media, I can joke that I know what everyone from my high school 20 plus years ago, what everyone's up
Yeah.
to, but I may not know what my next door neighbor's occupation is. And so I think we've really put an emphasis very, very slowly over time on quantity and not quality. And so when you look at, for like thousands of years, I may only know this area of people in my tribe, and I had connections with those people, and my tribe was really, really small. And I think that's how humans are hardwired to be tribal and to have a group of people that we have those very deep connections with. And so the tribe is the primary. And then that one step out, maybe, you know, in the 1800s, I don't know, the blacksmith 10 miles down the road that I saw twice a year and we would catch up. And then the outer circle are people that you don't really have a lot in common with. And I think we've turned that upside down and put our priorities on the outer people and not enough on the tribal. And so I
Mm-hmm.
think it's creating this concept of I am seeing what everyone is doing online and TikTok and social media, and like you're constantly trying to catch up. I want to see what this person's doing. I want to see. And so if I'm constantly trying to connect with people that like on the internet and online, I'm not creating meaningful relationships internally. So that was a very
Yeah.
long answer to your question, and I'm not sure I quite
No,
answered it.
that's so
I feel
good. I
very
think because
passionate about that. Like
yeah,
who's
I
to
think
the
it's,
right of your where you live and who's to the left of where you live. And most of us have no
yeah,
clue.
yeah, that's really good. I think when you think about the sort of relationship we have with people online versus the relationship we have with people in person, um, the thing that's challenging, I think, about the online connection is that it pretends to offer the intimacy that only an in-person connection can offer.
Mhm.
And so just knowing something about somebody from high school, for example, you use your example, doesn't mean I'm still in relationship with them, and or that even building on the relationship that was pre-existing, like way back when. And so it's kind of like a faux connection. Like I feel like I'm connected, and in that way, I think, to add to what you're saying, is that you can feel very connected to people, but it not be deep connection or
Yes.
meaningful connection, and that's what we really need for our well-being.
Yeah, and I think it's important to tease out that there's a difference between being alone versus
Mm,
being lonely. It's possible to
yeah.
be completely alone and not lonely, and it's possible to be
Hmm.
not alone and very lonely. So I think a lot of people can be. You've heard that I'm like in a crowd of people, and I don't feel
Yeah.
like I'm connected to any of them. And so I think it is very easy in our culture to not ever be alone, but to be lonely constantly.
Yeah, yeah. And so I quoted today from two books, and well, actually one book, but she's written two books. Jean Twenge is her name, and so she wrote a book called Generations, and she wrote another book a few years ago called iGen. And so iGen was written before the pandemic, and Generations was written after the pandemic. But she marks 2012 as being a critical year in American mental health, and the way she looks at it is in 2012 is when basically the smartphone and social media became
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
pervasive culturally. And you can track it in the data points that the more pervasive social media and our relationship with our devices has become, the less people go to parties, the less people spend in person hanging out, and the more lonely they feel, the more depressed they feel, and the quite frankly, it's a plummeting of well-being.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And have you seen any relationship with people that you've counseled or cared for where you've had to say, man, I think your relationship with your device is actually causing some of the challenges you're having, and and that relationship has to be called into question because that's really a root cause of your lack of well-being. I don't know if that makes sense to you. If you've ever
Yeah,
seen,
no, no, no.
sort of that
And
manifest.
well, I mean, how often have you been out to eat with people and you glance around and every single person is on their
Yeah.
telephones? I was somewhere where all of us were just in share, maybe like going to an appointment, and I glanced around and every single person was on their telephone. Nobody was making eye contact. Nobody was having those very important, brief human connections of
Mhm.
eye contact and smile, and you're leaning in because your head is down and you're
Yeah.
just looking what's here. And I think that that really impacts that connectivity. I know that teenagers, I have a high schooler now, and she is in no hurry to get her driver's license. And I remember when I was in high school, the
Yeah.
only way I would ever interact with people that I hung out with was if we would drive to their house. And so when I was able to get my driver's license that morning, like we're going to make that happen. And I think teens nowadays have that connectivity on Snapchat, on social media, and they're not in a hurry because it's easier and it's quicker and it requires a lot less effort. It requires
Mm.
less intimacy and it requires less vulnerability. Where if you take a
Mm.
picture, you add that whatever the glow filter or anything on it, and this is how I present to the world. And like what you were talking about, this imposter, if you really knew
Yeah.
who I was, acne, crazy hair, and all, you wouldn't like me. And so this creates this perpetual I have to present as how I am online, and that's unattainable.
Yeah. And I
So
think that
I
dovetails with what. Go ahead. Go ahead.
no, I was gonna say, I think all of us are probably guilty of prioritizing our telephones
Yeah.
over family, loved ones. And I think it takes like intentionality. And I know it's very easy to tell my kids, oh, you can't have telephone. My kids have screen time. I don't have that. And I find myself last night we were watching TV and I just want to see, I mean, even here's my telephone right here. I'm charging it because I know that after we hang up, I'm going to have to check to see who called me, who sent me a text. And so I'm planning for what's happening after. I'm going to go ahead and put this under here because I'm planning for what's happening after, and I'm not being present with what's happening here. And
Yeah,
hopefully I'm
that's
not
so
the only
good.
one. Chime
Yeah.
in if that's you too, Nate.
No, I think that's it. I think part of what that is too is Annie, like to dive into the theological world on that a little bit, is that it's a pretending to be more than you are. Like, we're finite beings with very limited capacity. And to your earlier illustration, like, we probably are wired more for that immediate life connection relationship, because that's all we can actually handle in any kind of like real sense. But when we open ourselves up to the world of relationships and to the world of knowledge and to the world of, when the whole world's at our fingertips, it's a kind of a pretending to be a lot more than we are. We just don't have the capacity for all of that. We're not God. We're not infinite. We don't have an infinite amount of time and space. We're very limited. And I think, to your point, I think positive steps that people could take if they're listening to the podcast really is asking a question of what 2 or 3 relationships that I'm close to in proximity that are life giving that I need to invest in today. And it may seem dumb, but that really does affect your well being in life.
Yeah, and to also know that the tricky part about treating loneliness, unlike anxiety, we were talking about last
Mm-hmm.
week, is that if you do the breathing techniques or eat the
Yeah.
Sour Patch Kids or anything, it will help immediately. It's not going to cure it, but it's going to help it.
Yeah.
With loneliness, if I make that telephone call to go out
Yeah.
for coffee tomorrow, I'm not necessarily going to feel any less lonely
Mm,
right when I do the thing I'm supposed to
that's good.
do. And so
Yeah.
I think we have to remember that it's outcome, like the process leads to the
Yeah.
outcome. And so to know that I'm not necessarily going to feel less
Mm,
lonely after having coffee with one person, that all these things that you're doing, you're planting the seeds to eventually cultivate, looking
yes.
back and saying, oh, right now, I don't know when the switch was, but now I'm not feeling as lonely as I was in August. It's the holidays now. And so to know that
Mm,
it is going to be very gradual and there's not going to be the switch that happens with other mental health areas that tend to be like more instantaneously treatable. Does that make sense?
oh, that's no. I'm so glad you said that. I really struggled with the teaching this week for that very reason, because I really loved the anxiety message landing on observe, name, and displace. And it feels I can
Mm-hmm.
use that right away and put that to use. And um, go make deep friendships that make you feel deeply connected. You can't microwave that.
Well, and if you
It's not
could,
something you can
you would have
microwave.
already
Yeah,
tried that.
yeah,
Right. And so
yeah.
it's
That's
hard
right.
because the concept that you're trying to not have anymore,
Yeah,
you only have to just make those connections and then you won't have that anymore. And so it's almost like a catch 22 of, well, if I
yes.
could, I would, but I can't. So this is
Mm,
why I'm in this. And so
that's
it
really good.
turns into this tricky sort of matrixy kind of thing of not being able to really do and implement what you actually want to happen.
Yeah, that's really good. That's really good. That's helpful to hear you say that sort of out loud. That this is one of those areas of life where you can't microwave it, but also if you could, you would have, because it's a deep feeling. Like, loneliness is a deep feeling. And I said in the sermon that it's difficult to talk this to confess that you feel lonely, because it's almost like confessing that you're not likable.
Mm-hmm.
And it's and I think there's a belief that, oh, other people have these deep connections and I'm all alone. And so I'm glad you opened it up the way you did. That loneliness isn't like an experience that only 1 or 2 of us have in life. Like, all of us have
Mm-hmm.
a season of loneliness we can pull on and speak to, because it's common to the human experience. I want to turn a little bit and talk about that congruency thing. It showed up last week in our podcast, and you brought it up, and I thought it was really powerful. And so I gave you a call out my message today, and thinking about this idea that, like, when we feel like we're living as an imposter, like, our who we present, to use the language you've used, who we present isn't our true self, and our true self is someone that we are concealing. And when you're living with that kind of imposter syndrome for a really long time, and if you're listening to this and you're like, you're new to the gospel, the answer I gave to that is that the gospel gives you this powerful ability to put your dark moments under the bright light. And so, because the gospel is receiving Christ's righteousness and Him taking away your shame and sinfulness, and so that gives you the ability to do that. But it still tends to be a thing that all of us deal with, Christian people too, where they're living kind of a double life. They're presenting, they're showing roses, but they've really got weeds in their garden. They're not true to who they are. And in some ways, I think we have to live. It's not wrong to put your best self out. Um, but it is not healthy to live like a life of sustained imposter syndrome. Can you speak to like how that works? Like how does that? What's going on when we are incongruent? Like when where our inside self isn't the same as
Yeah.
what we're presenting, and how does that affect our mental well being?
Well, I think it's in regards to talking about loneliness, I think where the problem with imposter syndrome comes in, 'cause I think imposter syndrome in general isn't always wrong
Mm.
if it's used in such a way as to like help you through it. Like I'm gonna act as
Yeah.
if I know what I'm doing when I'm, I don't know, doing something with my kids. My kids are never gonna know, and then I can go back to
Yeah.
who I truly am. I think
Ah.
with loneliness, when you
Yeah.
act as if for so long, nobody ever knows that you aren't. And so if I'm
Uh,
acting as if I'm not lonely, people
yeah.
are like, she's great. She seems happy. I'm not going to reach out to have coffee
Ooh.
with her because she looks like she's got her stuff together. And so if I'm
Yeah.
acting as if with this imposter, as if I'm not, like we talked about last week, people are going to treat me as if I am not.
Mm.
And I'm never going to get to the other side of openness, transparency, and vulnerability. And that's where true change happens. And imposter syndrome needs to be temporary and to serve a temporary purpose. But you can't live your life as an imposter because then that's who you are. And no one's ever going to know otherwise.
Okay. Let me. I want to
That makes
reflect this
sense?
back to you because I no.
Okay.
I'm going to reflect it back to you because I think this is worth getting. And I wish I would have talked to you about this before the message. I think it's a really valuable, really good point in this idea that what happened. I think loneliness is such a deep feeling that we don't want to admit it. So I'm reflecting back to you what I heard you say. We don't want to admit it, and when we are living into our imposter syndrome, we will pretend like we had it all together relationally. When deep down inside we're feeling lonely, and that's that catch 22. Like
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
you're not going to get healing from your loneliness as long as you're pretending you got it all together in your relationships, because everybody's going to treat you like you have it all together in your relationships, and no one's going to actually
Yeah,
know that what's going on inside of you is you have this deep feeling of like not being connected to other people, and that's actually inhibiting your healing process, and you won't get through the healing process until you're able to say out loud, like, I really am feeling lonely, and I know like I pretend like I got it all together, but I really don't. Is that getting what
yes,
you're saying? Yeah.
100%. 100%. That in order for that change to happen, people have to know that you are lonely. So you can say, this is what I need. I'm putting it out to you. Can you help me? And I can guarantee there are people out there that would say, I would love to go to coffee with you. I would love to do whatever. Um, because it is, again, what we're talking about. It's human, it's inherent human nature to have connections.
Mm-hmm. I wish I would have done the research on this, but I think there are a lot of extroverts listening in, and I don't know the data on this, but I do know that we probably tend to cope into like our personality traits, and so an extroverted person can often present like, oh, I've got it all together, and I'm really connected with a lot of people, but every connection is like really shallow and not very deep, and with a heart's longing for some deep connection. And if that's you and you're listening in, like, I think this is a good point for you to kind of hit maybe pause on the podcast and ask yourself the question, like, am I being true with myself, and am I being true with those around me, and who is it that I might need to say something to that would be like, hey, I don't have I don't have it all good. I'm kind of lonely, and I could use like some deep connection. I got some things I need to share. I think that'd be a great
Yeah.
step towards healing.
Well, no, and that actually, I really love that you brought up about
Yeah.
introverts and extroverts because,
Yeah.
as a whole, generally, introverts tend to need a little bit less connection time,
Right.
or they need more of a quality, and extroverts tend to need a little bit more. That is really, really general. And so it's
Mm.
important to know if you're an introvert or an extrovert. And an
Yeah.
extrovert, please don't go and ask an introvert to have coffee twice a week. Like that's not going to work. So I
Yeah.
am an introvert. I love parties, I love people, and I need to be by myself often. And
Yeah.
so I have a person, she is my person, and she's an introvert too. And so she and I will go have coffee, and I will say, okay, so it's August. let's put something on the calendar for the end of September. Cool. And I have that on the calendar, and my emotional need is met. Like I don't need any more than that. But I know that I have that on the calendar to anticipate. And so an extrovert, if you connect with another extrovert, you can be like, every Tuesday we have coffee or whatever. And so introverts try to connect a little more with extroverts, or introverts, and extroverts try to connect a little more with extroverts too.
That's really
That's
good. A good
important.
know yourself thing. Because I'm an extrovert, Annie, and you know, if you hear of a good party happening tonight, I'm in.
I'll be asleep.
I'm all.
I'll wish you well.
I,
No,
I, I, yeah.
I joke having kids in like teams and sports and stuff. You always know who the extroverts are for who likes to do the after party. All the kids that like to go out after the team dinner, and all the parents that like to go out for drinks after the game. I'm just like, see you tomorrow. But
Done.
yeah, so
Peace. I'm out. But
I
yeah,
think that's
that is.
important to know that.
Yeah, yeah. You know, I've heard before that everybody has also. I mean, in addition to being introverted, extroverted, everybody has like a different number of connectors. Like they, if you think about a Lego block, there different Lego blocks have different numbers of connections that Lego block can make. And some of us have a lot of connectors, and I'm one that has a lot of connectors. And actually, my challenge in this area is if I'm not careful, I'll have a million relationships that are an inch deep, and then I'll lack real deep connection. And
Mm-hmm.
that's really the place where I feel lonely. And people will look at me and go, "Oh, he's just connecting to everybody and high fiving everybody all the time." But sometimes I can feel lonely in that because of my connections aren't very deep. And so even though I'm an extrovert and I have lots of connections, my block is probably 6 to 8 that I can
Mm-hmm.
maintain, like relationships I can really maintain that are deep and abiding. Some may have more and some have less. Like you may have one or two. We all have different, I think, a number of those. And I don't know that that's an absolute rule that you create for yourself and try to meet, but just kind of knowing generally that we're all different. And I think that does help. And like if somebody has, more deep connections and you only have one or two, well, if you only need one or two, then be content with that. I don't know if that, does that help at all?
No, that's a really good. I've never heard that analogy. I think that's great, and I
Yeah.
would sort of take that and add that I think when we're talking about connections, is it a capital C versus a
Mm,
lowercase c? So I have a
that's
lot
good.
of lowercase c
Yeah.
people that I don't necessarily like. We do a like it's not, I want to say transactional, but if I have a question on something, or I need that, those are my lowercase c, and I think it's easy to say that those lowercase c's are the people that I get my connections with, and that's not accurate. It's the capital C connectors who are the ones that help you not feel lonely rather than accomplish tasks. And so I think it's important to sort
Yeah.
of tease out that connectivity. But I
That's
like that
really good.
analogy.
Yeah. That's really good. There's something that I think, and this is just life experience. I don't have like a biblical text for it or anything like that. I mean, I do think, things we talked about today that were really helpful is that you are made for relationships. And so if you feel lonely, then know that God made you for relationships. Like he made you to be connected. It's part of the ultimate fabric of the universe. It's not good for any human being to be alone. That's a clear message of the scriptures that God made you that way. Um, but I have found, and I don't know, in my marriage, like Vanessa and I have been talking about this a little bit recently, that there are things that I could say to her that she'll receive and she'll receive fine. But if a friend says it to her, like a good friend says it to her, it can be more transformative in her life. And
Mm-hmm.
we were talking about the other day, and she was like, "Oh, I'm so sorry that my friend said this to me, and I took it to heart and really applied it to my life. And even though you had said it to me, for a while, and it didn't really sink in. And same thing was happening for her. Like she said things to me, but if my friend Jeremy says it to me, it rings differently.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think our friends can really speak into our lives in ways that can be real transformative. Um, I don't know if there's anything to add to that idea, Annie, but I was thinking about that the other day, or the other day with Vanessa. It didn't show up in the message, but a true friendship, a true connection, can go a long way in your life journey and helping you to make positive change and really aid your mental health. But do you have anything to add to that? Have you seen or witnessed that even in your counseling?
Yeah, no, I think maybe I'm trying to analyze what the origin of that is,
Yeah.
and wondering if
Yeah.
in the span of a 18-hour period that you and your partner are around each other, that you tell her
Yeah.
20 things, and when she goes out for
Yes.
coffee she only hears a couple things, and so it's
Mm.
taking in
Yes.
less information than the partner that, and
Yes.
I'm guilty of this too, it turns into want. Okay, yeah. And
Yeah.
then you hear from this
Yeah.
other person and you're like, that is genius, when your partner told you the exact same thing. um I'm guilty of that as well. But
Yeah, I'm pretty
yeah.
sure that when I'm speaking, Vanessa just hears wah wah wah
Mhm.
the entire time. Vanessa's my wife, so that's probably what she hears. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
So I
okay,
have a question.
we're at, yes,
I have a, can I ask you a quick question? I was going to ask you
do
this
it.
earlier, but it really hit me hard that when you said at the intro that the church is the hardest place to talk about your
Hmm.
feelings, talk about your emotions. And I'm curious, number one, in general, why you feel that is. And number two, how
Yes.
can our church culture really challenge that? Because if
Uh,
that's true, and I agree, that's a
yeah.
problem. Like, church should be the place where we come in and just throw it on the table and people rally around you. So how can our culture, how can our church, what is our church doing well? Because clearly we
Mm-hmm.
are. And
Mm-hmm.
what else do people in our church who are hopefully listening to this podcast, what can all of us do to sort of change that culture?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that question. It is like when I read that in the book, there's a book on mental health in your church I've been reading in preparation for this series. It's not, written for general audience, but just sort of more for the well-being of the church. A lot of stories of clinical issues, that kind of thing in the book. And when the authors wrote that statement that many people turn to people outside the church to express mental health concerns, not people inside the church, and I think that that comes from this, I for some reason, even though the gospel is I can't, he did, because he did, I can. We sometimes live like, oh, if I've been a Christian for a long time, then I must have my life together,
Mm-hmm.
or and I think this has something to do with how we present on Sunday mornings. I mean, if your only connection is with Christian people on Sunday morning, and people are, it's New Mexico, and our church is in New Mexico, so it's pretty relaxed in terms of casual dress or whatever, but still people are genuinely happy to see each other. They smile a lot. They high five. You ask, "How are you doing?" and people say, "Just fine, thank you very much." And there's no opportunity for deep connection there. And I think that sometimes what people do is they think, "Oh, everybody here must have their stuff together." Even though we have a big sign on the front of our door that says "No perfect people allowed," it can still sneak in to a place like New City, where people can think, "Oh, wow, this is a place where people just have their stuff together. It's not for a place like for people like me." Or when somebody has a sudden onset of mental unwellness, but they've had a history of like kind of being somebody people has depended upon, and it can be disorienting. Like, and so if you're in a church environment and you've had a small group leader who's been like poured into your life, and that small group leader has been given spiritual authority, and you've trusted in them and they've cared for you, but then they go through a crisis, it can feel like, oh, I've got to pretend like I got it all together, when that's just total hogwash. It's just not the gospel. We're going to have seasons. Like, life is seasonal, and you're going to have ups and you're going to have
Yeah.
downs. You're going to have times when you're really doing great in your mental health, and times when you're really doing poorly in your mental health. And that's just the way life goes. And so I do think we have to lean into the gospel, which is like, you are saved not by your good deeds, but by the good deeds of Jesus. He's given you his righteousness. You have nothing to lose in admitting your failures and weaknesses, because he's already taken care of them. And so for the Christian, there's really nothing to lose to put my stuff on the table and to admit that I got stuff going on, and whether it be mental unwellness or whether it be sin, or something terrible I've done. It could be just the conditions of my life have changed, and so I'm really not mentally well. But whatever that issue is, like, Christians should be the people that can lay it on the table. And I think it has a lot to do with the multiple factors. So to summarize that, I mean, there's a lot
Yeah.
of rambling,
Yeah.
Annie.
No.
You asked, yeah, but I think to summarize those thoughts as I played them out loud is, one is, if you are going to church and you don't have deep connection, you might think that everybody has it all together, and they don't. And you might think that you might not know that people are much more honest than they are. You just might not know. So if you're engaged in a community group, you know that. Like people are honest in community group and they share their real life stuff and nobody's pretending in those environments. And so I would say give it a shot, engage in a higher level. But also if you're one of those people that's, you're long in the tooth in terms of Christianity, and if you had any pride in like having your life together and something happened in your life and it threw it upside down, it's okay. Like it's not only is it okay, it's completely appropriate in the Christian way to admit failure, to admit fault, to admit like, hey, situation has changed my life and I'm not doing well. It's okay to admit that, and to seek help and hope, and that's all okay. So I don't know if that answers the question as to why.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I've actually been blown away. People have said to me throughout the series already, "Thank you so much for doing this." Tears in their eyes. I've never felt safe talking about my mental health story before, and I honestly that took me by surprise. I just knew I'm just shocked. I'm a church planter, so I've been in this church for 13, 14 years. I haven't known anything different than this, and so if people are coming from different other contexts, I just can't speak to those because I've never lived in them. So I know that they're there. I just don't know. I don't know enough about them to speak to them.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
Okay.
that was a lot. Annie's not gonna ask me any more questions in this podcast. I know that.
No, just no.
Late on a Sunday, she asked me one question.
No,
that was like 15-minute answer.
No, I think it's also important to really kind of like what you're talking about, where I think loneliness can be like a season. And so I think in general that if I'm not lonely now, I can go help other people. And I can guarantee when you say you're a long in the tooth Christian, you have your stuff together, in a month, I may not, or I can like guarantee I'm not. And so I think taking it now, like knowing I'm in a healthy place, I can reach out, knowing in a couple months, a year, 2 years, I may not. And so it's this constant changing of supporting each other, and just knowing that's what our church is, that whoever's the stronger ones in August are going to support the ones that aren't. And then it may change in January. And there's this constant toggle of supporting each other.
That's really good. The story we told today was Jess's story, and she told a story of just like having young kids and how isolating that is. And I had so many moms say, oh, "I just need to hear that." I didn't, and older moms who are out of that season, like not that I want to call my wife an older mom. She's definitely young, but she's old enough not to have. We don't have little children at home. And Vanessa goes, I totally know what that feels like. I've totally been there. That was a season of life. And so we can be there for each other in those different seasons, And so if you're in a season like Jess is, we talked about in her story today of like, oh man, the young kids have kind of taken me out of the relational game in ways I didn't expect. Older moms can say, hey, look, they can speak into that, encourage, strengthen. I think it's just really good what you're saying, Annie.
Cool. All right. So what's on for next week? Give people a little preview. Gotta
so
hanging. What's
next? A little preview. Something no one has ever dealt with in life. Burnout. That's what we're talking about next week.
Nothing to add about that. Cool.
And so, here's the thing about loneliness. The summarized loneliness. We said loneliness isn't like being alone. It's just lacking deep connection. Burnout is going to be one of those things we're going to talk about when you come to that place in life when you don't feel useful anymore. And a lot of us have felt that in our life. We just feel like, I don't know how useful I am anymore. And that loss of complete energy. It's going to be a really fun message. I'm looking forward to it. I hope you'll be there for it. Encourage other people. But also I'm looking forward to the after podcast where Andy can help me out in processing all the issues related to burnout.
All right.
Awesome.
I'm there.
Thank you guys for being here. 34 minutes. We're a minute shorter than last week. Hope you have a great week. I really do hope you'll make a deep connection with somebody this week. God bless.
Bye.
All right. We're stopping.